if we try to change the system, and if we try to do so via massive multilateral processes, we're likely not going to manage because reality is too complex for that to be really feasible. And I'm massively simplifying that, but that is seemingly what's coming through. How do we intervene in the conditions that people are in that are leading to the narratives that emerge from those conditions? And what are the adjacent possibles in that sense that we can operate with? Where can we offer people the belonging and the sense of feeling heard and the sense of liberation that they are so sorely seeking? Where can they offer that themselves?
Paddy Loughman, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you on this bright September morning?
Thank you, Amanda. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and with everyone listening or watching. I am in Glasgow, in Scotland. I am well. I am at the end of a long period of intensity where like all the buses come at once. So I'm slightly strung out by that, but feeling good about much of the stuff that's happened. Apart from maybe the stuff in the wider world, which we'll probably get into a bit.
Right.
It is a nice day here in Glasgow currently.
Yay. You live very close to where I went to school, which is quite exciting, actually. I was looking on a map and remembering walking across Maxwell Park to get to the trains. And I was, quite young, and I took 2, sometimes 3 separate trains, and then quite a long walk to a bus stop, and then a bus home. And I'm not sure that kind of thing happens anymore. But I'm still here. We made it. Alrighty. So you and I are both pretty dedicated to the idea that humans are a storied species, and that the stories we tell ourselves and each other about ourselves and each other and our place in the human world are how our culture describes itself and how it brings itself continuously into being. And the stories, it seems to me, are becoming more extreme by the day in various polarities. Our polarities are becoming more polar, shall we say. So tell us a little bit about how you became interested in narrative as an agency of change, if I am right, in that being how you see the world.
Yeah, it's a long question, or a long answer rather, but I'll try and make it a brief one. I was at university studying English because I couldn't study psychology because I didn't have very good maths. Because I was moved up a year when I was 7, having been living in Africa and then at boarding school in England. And missed the whole year and never caught up, and it became disastrous for me. I'm actually like capable of it, but I just have this deep trauma of not being able to do maths. So when it came to choosing a subject, I wanted to do psychology because I was very interested in how people understood themselves and each other in the world and wanted to get into that. But I didn't have the maths to do the stats side of that. Maybe a blessing in disguise. I ended up doing English instead. My partner now, my wife, Shawnee, she did psychology and wished she'd done English. So we kind of held the bed a little bit. And then I got into acting, actually, which is where I met my wife, Shawnee. Acting at university was sort of a way out of a whole bunch of trauma I was experiencing at the time as a result of my upbringing that I hadn't processed, was trying to process, and acting really gave me some belonging and something to be doing. And it really gave me a sense of the power of story. It was a very addictive process, acting. I mean, any kind of performance where you're in front of people and that moves them in some way, you're hooked for life, really. So I got into that, and then carried on through university doing that. Went into the world of work trying to do it. Went to drama school, and that itself was a very kind of destructive process, really. The school that I went to is now shut down. It was nicknamed a trauma center at the time, so that might give you some idea why. Although it produced some incredible actors over time. But the process of that was very destabilizing, and I left it wanting to be an actor, but not really psychologically cut out for it. And found my way into initially corporate innovation, which was sort of emerging out of advertising at the time as a kind of newish discipline for how to basically help businesses make more money. But it involved a lot of behavioral science, and a lot of the people involved in it come from advertising, of course, that kind of storytelling. And alongside that, the climate was kicking off, and my dad was a top exec in Shell, and I was very aware of that. And I became curious about the role of communications in that. And that led me to leave that innovation agency and end up at a company called Wolf Olins, which is a brand consultancy. And their basic premise is that brands are stories that live in our heads, and they're put there by every interaction we have in the world with that organization or company or product or whatever it is. And so I basically got a very kind of fast and quite intense and high level, really, introduction into a lot of different understanding that helped me to kind of arrive at this position that story is a fundamental part of our reality, and stories we encounter and tell ourselves all the time are shaping what we do and how we do it, and the world around us. And since then, really, I've just continued to explore that as I left that corporate world and went into kind of campaigning and climate related work. And then beyond that, that understanding has sort of continued with me and evolved as I've brought in many other inputs to try and further it. So yeah, that's sort of how it began, kind of.
Okay. And actually we could probably spend at least a podcast unpicking various of the sections of that and never get onto anything else. I want to unpick two bits. Drama as the trauma center. Okay, so let me say where I'm coming from. I've been away for 6 weeks, which gives me amount of time of thinking. And one of the things that's arising at the top of my awareness is that we need to do the inner work. We need to do at least what Dick Schwartz says, almost all of us all of the time are walking around in a state of internal civil war. And some of that civil war we have created ourselves. Quite a lot of it was installed by our childhood, and quite an amount of it we inherited depending on our past history. And I'm remembering our story before we recorded about your dad being a top executive at Shell as a response to what his dad was doing, which was as a response to what his dad was doing. And I'm really interested in that kind of generational reactivity. And yet, our parents' generation didn't have the tools that we have now for self-healing. And very likely our children's generation will have more and better tools. But at the moment, we have tools that might actually work in ways that previous generations didn't. And it seems to me incumbent on all of us to do the work. We can't say necessarily where that's going to take us, but we can look around and see that a lot of us are responding from very wounded, triggered places to the world, and that healing those woundings so that we don't act out of trigger would be a good thing. And I'm really curious as to why anybody thinks that creating a drama school that is called the Trauma Centre is a useful way to help you into something where acting seems to me, as an outsider who's never done it, to be a form of empathic exploration of what it is to be somebody else, which is the opposite of trauma. Can we just unpick that in terms of looking at healing? And if you want to bring in your generational lineage, then go for it. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a nickname for the set. It was the official name was Drama Center, but what happened there was there were a few different schools of thought that were informing and practice that were informing that school. One of which was Stanislavski's method, is sort of well known as method acting, which is very much about returning to traumatic events in your past to kind of mine them for feeling and material, really, to then bring into a scene as another person, as another character. And what I think was happening at the school at the time was the recognition that, basically that came about because Stanislavski was jealous of imaginative actors and wanted to sort of, basically kind of hack a way of being a good actor. And so that was the sort of the system he developed. There are famous stories of him, demonstrating, I think it was Michael Chekhov in an exercise where he asks Michael Chekhov to perform a scene where it's very sad and there's, a lot of upset. And Chekhov does this, and then at the end, Stanislavski is like, well done, well done. And what did you do for this? What emotional recall did you bring to the scene in order to perform so well? And Michael Chekhov says, well, yeah, I was remembering my dog dying in the road and, holding him as his last breath, and it escaped his body. And he never had a dog, right? So he just imagined it in the scene, and it sort of demonstrated exactly this. So there were other schools. Meisner was one that we were working with, but I think there was a lot of people being put through stuff, and a lot of people in my case, certainly like returning to very traumatic wells of anger, and not really being held in the process of dealing with those. Um, and I think it was quite a sort of yeah, there was a lot of camaraderie, um, but it was also a system of preparation for people to go and become individually successful. So it was, yeah, it was problematic, I'd say.
Horrible.
Yeah, pretty horrible. Yeah. Um, but
And the trauma culture validating trauma as a way of finding truth instead of healing trauma as a way of expressing the totality of being, I
yes,
guess.
yeah,
One can see why it's closed. I'm kind of hoping that drama schools are different now, but maybe they're not.
yeah. I mean, I think there is improvement. Um, but it was, yeah, one of the things that goes on with that is you by reusing a memory, a traumatic memory, you have to keep enhancing it every time to make it continue to
Mm.
work.
Mm.
And so people like, I think it's true of Marlon Brando and Marilyn Monroe in particular. They've been sort of, it's been suggested that they kind of fell victim to this and basically retold their own stories to themselves so extensively. And we can do this, right? We can change them enough
Sure.
to the extent that they became more traumatic for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. That
Uh,
sounds like that's almost guaranteed in that system, unless you somehow manage to wall off. All right.
exactly.
Let's not head all the way down that rabbit hole because that would probably take us the rest of the hour.
Right.
You moved into a place where you were taught that branding is about story. It sounds like you were getting a very rapid psychology degree, or at least explanation of how our limbic systems work and how we relate to narrative. Is it possible for you to synthesize bits of that for us to then use as platforms to step off into how we might use narrative in a different way or explore narrative in a different way?
I think so. I mean, it's a very live question at the moment, and I'm involved in a project that's been doing some research into what we've been, well, many people have been calling deep narrative, which is the sort of the idea that there's something deeper than the surface narratives we are kind of dealing with in our media and our storytelling much of the time. Um, and so this question of what narrative change is and what we're referring to in that is sort of quite a live one, really. I suppose what I took, yeah, from that process at Wolf Oland's, which is still kind of permeating through now, actually, is is the recognition that when we think of branding, we think of logo, we think of colors, we think of the visual kind of surface assets, if you like, of a thing, and maybe the story being told literally in the advertising for that organization or in the tagline, let's say. But what we recognized was that actually the brand that we're seeking to influence as an organization trying to steer a company to be successful is living within the person and between people, and that thing that we call brand, or that we might call narrative here, is the product of the sum total of all interactions those people are having with each other, with the world around them, with that organization, with other organizations. That's what's generating that. And I suppose what brand strategy became about was trying to close the gap between the rhetoric of the organization and the reality that exists within the person. And there's some, I mean, fascinating stuff about where that can live in people. How I think they identified that a really strong brand love, like a sort of Apple fan person or a Nike fan person, it lives in the same part of the brain next to it, that their kind of familial love exists. So there's a kind of very close relationship to that. And again, it makes sense. We're seeking belonging, we're seeking connection, and denied it much of the time, and we look for it where we can. So that kind of becomes that. But yeah, how that then applies to the sort of wider concept of narrative change, and what we're talking about, using narrative to change our cultures and our systems more broadly. Ultimately, any branding effort is typically working into the existing systems, not trying to change them really. It might be trying to tweak things a little bit. But when we're talking more fundamentally, yeah, that's when it becomes somewhat of a different task, should we say? But we can, yeah, there are learnings, and please come in. I'm noticing your.
Yeah, yes. I'm thinking. Well, I was thinking a lot of things. I'm thinking as an Apple fan. What What I find interesting about Apple is because I got on board, I think I bought my first Apple computer in 1984, which is probably before you were born. But there we go. I was writing my books on little Apple Mac thing where the screen was an integral part of this little chunky computer and was the size of our current mobile phones, basically. And a part of me still conceives of Apple as this edgy, radical, slightly hippie, off the edge of normal capitalism, started in a garage by a couple of blokes, thing that I enjoy because it is all of those things, while the rest of my conscious mind knows that it's a multi-billion dollar industry. Sorry, I'll do that one again. While the rest of my brain knows that it's a multi-billion dollar industry that gives Donald Trump a gold bar with his face on it. Sorry, that makes me very cross. And those two, the bit that's cross and the bit that still thinks Apple is edgy and lovely and off the edge of capitalism, coexist in my head, and they don't clash that often unless I actually explicitly choose to. It's a really interesting experience, and I still am working with you on an Apple computer, partly because once you're locked in there, it's really hard to mix and match with anything else. And why would Microsoft be any better? Let's not go into that one. So I'm just that it's what narrative is, what we tell ourselves, and how we look at it. I'm bringing together. I'm looking at the Stories for Life website, and people, it's an amazing website. It's totally worth an amount of your time to go into it. And you've got a quote on the front page from someone whose name I'm going to completely murder, Wangari Maathai. You'll say it right. There comes a time when humanity is called to shift to a new level of consciousness. That time is now. And I think that's where you and I are both going. I think that conscious evolution, the evolution of our consciousness, consciously chosen, has to happen, or my narrative is we're fucked, basically, because it's not hard to see how totalitarian narratives are taking hold because of their overt simplicity and all the rest of it. And yet, I'm watching quite a lot of people in the space that we both occupy who have narratives of change, who have narratives of indivisibility and inseparability, and we are all still locked in a system that sees humanity as separate from the rest of the world. And our provision of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, however we define it, our shelter, our food, our water, our tribal securities are all embedded in a system that is the megalith taking us straight over the edge of the cliff. And we can create all the stories we like, and we're not seeing yet behavioral change. So I'm really interested in that concept of shifting consciousness as possibly a fractal thing and an emergent thing, and potentially there being a tipping point in consciousness, which then would create systemic shift in a way that we cannot predict, because if we can predict it, it's not systemic shift. That's leaping quite a long way from branding to consciousness shift, but it feels like you're one of the few people I know who is exploring at that liminal edge between narrative and consciousness. Does that make sense? And can you take it deeper and further?
It really does. And of course, we're into questions of what is consciousness and the rest, but to just begin with that branding again, a kind of very simplistic example of the kind of change, the kind of change that might be being talked about here is we worked with Tesco. That was the first thing I did working for that company in Wolfoland. And when we started working with them, they were the most hated brand in Britain by quite some margin.
Why? Why did we all hate Tesco's and not Sainsbury's or Aldi or Waitrose? What had Tesco's done?
They were seen as this sort of cold, monolith, corporate, unpleasant, impersonal, like dominating force in society, and people didn't like them.
Okay, and for people not in the UK, I just need to say that Tesco is one of our major supermarket brands, probably a bit like Walmart in the US, but not quite as much of an overwhelming fungus.
Yeah.
But yes.
But the task was to sort of, re-enchant people with Tesco, basically.
That's hard.
And that became a process of simplify and amplify was the kind of approach we took to that. So, one of the things I was doing was reducing the number of brands they had. For example, they had 150 different brands that were running at once to kind of cover all these different products they were making. And we kind of brought that right down to a much simpler structure. And then most importantly, the logo didn't change, and this is obviously telling in all of this, but the experience was a big emphasis of what we then looked at. The digital experience, the store experience, the signage, the interaction with people, the tone of voice through all of that, like just all that, like basically anytime someone was having an interaction with Tesco, the work we were doing was sort of guiding that to be something different. And the other sort of strand to that, which was being done by an ad agency, was the stories that were then being told through advertising, which of course, we reached a lot of people. And that then needed to work with what was happening with the experience. And basically, as a result of all of that careful, thoughtful work, 3 years later, they were one of the top, most liked brands in Britain.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
That happened
Nothing
quickly.
material had changed, really.
Well, that depends on how you think about it. I guess a lot materially had changed because people's experience on a daily basis of that organization had fundamentally shifted to be something quite different.
But it's still basically selling you the products of capitalism at a reasonably discounted rate because they're still shafting the farmers and they're still acting the way they behave.
Yeah. So the reason I'm using this as an example, I think, is just because it shows how plastic, how pliable things can be, and also how much of that perception is resulting from experience, is resulting from the sum total of experience. And I think what we tend to have had a sort of, well, there's been a bit of an evolution, I guess, right, in what we would call narrative change or kind of stratcoms from a long time ago, people saying, well, if we just tell people information, then they will think differently and do differently.
Which is still the attitude that left-wing politics takes. Let's just explain to people why they're wrong and they will completely understand and then they will think like we think. And it has never worked. And it isn't going to work.
And it's not that information doesn't play a role. It does, of course. It plays a role in the conversation. But I think what's become more understood is where it plays a role, and that certainly we can't lead with it and assume I think it's known as the information deficit model. That we just need to give people the right information. And there's a really, really interesting history behind why we end up in that position of thinking that. I think Adam Curtis talks about it really well somewhere along the line. But yeah, we won't go into that now. But
give us a real edited highlight, because I think it is interesting, because a lot of left-wing politically aligned people do still think that you just explain to people why they're wrong and they'll understand, and it's not going to work.
I mean, it's grounded in Enlightenment rationality, which we know is a sort of mistaken interpretation of what Indigenous communities were doing at the time, now Northern Canada. I think David Graeber talks about that well with David Wenlow in their book, Dawn of Everything.
Yes, essential reading.
Yes, so good. But there's also, it was partly an understandable reaction to what I was just describing about the world of brand, the kind of dark arts of PR and branding and advertising, very, very manipulative. They are using emotion and kind of human desire and division as well, and kind of competition to foster interest in and behaviors towards buying things and whatever. That I think people who were more pro-social, more what was called, it's still called progressive, were kind of wary of, and they didn't want to engage in those dark arts, and so they opted out of it in order to sort of double down on, well, we trust people. If we give them the information, they will do the right thing. And unfortunately, that's just not how we work. And that's become clearer as we've kind of understood through the science and so on. But I guess one way to think about it is it's like playing a game of tennis, say, right? And you're if you're choosing to sort of not do what they have disparagingly called dark arts, then you're basically putting a racket down. And you're opting out of playing altogether. And if you opt out of playing, then you will lose. As simple as that. So you play that game because that game is human consciousness, human behavioral psychology. It's not something we can kind of get out of. You can cheat at the game, and the way that people cheat at the game is through deception mainly. So I think what we see more and more is people recognizing that we have to play this game, but we do it with as much kind of integrity and as much kind of good intention as possible, where so often the bad actors are operating out of some kind of deception intention in order to kind of serve their own ends somehow. Yeah.
Oh, yes, let's unpick this. It's not where I thought we were going, but this is a new avenue. Okay, so back in 2017, I had just done the Masters at Schumacher and I'd written my thesis on the cognitive neuroscience of information and narrative.
Mm.
And the 2017 election arose and Jeremy Corbyn was there and it looked like he was riding a wave. And I had an in to Labour transiently and almost accidentally. And I wrote them a selection of things of, here's my understanding. I just read a few things on metaphor, like off all the rest. Mm-hmm. If you want to really reach people, here's what will hit the limbic system. And one of them was you show Theresa May, who was the UK Prime Minister trying for re-election, and Donald Trump, who was sadly the US President at the time, walking across a symbol that we all recognize, probably a Union Jack flag, trailing dog shit across it, and you're hitting disgust and revulsion and shame and all of those things, and they will be forever tagged to these people. Which, it wasn't huge integrity, and I very probably got an email back from somebody going, "I'm sorry, I've just done too much therapy. We can't do that," and that was good. I can absolutely see that we don't want to play the game in the way the right plays it, which is absolutely the race to the bottom of the brainstem and going for the lowest common denominator. But we still lost that election. And the world is where it is. And if I ever had time and was able to clone myself, I would write the novel of the counterfactual of what would the world look like if we'd won. Not including a coup on day one by the military. And Steve Bannon, back in 2011, when asked by Michael Moore for a bit that got cut from, I think, Fahrenheit 9/11, said, he was asked, why does the right always win? And he said, we know exactly what we want and there is nothing we will not do to get it. And what they want is a white supremacist patriarchal theocracy run along the lines of the Inquisition. And he said, we're going for headshots and you guys are all still in a pillow fight. Yeah. And I watch modern politics and in conversation with people who are politically active and in the House of Commons at the moment, and they're not even picking up the pillows. We'll have a petition for PR. It's like, guys, have you not looked at the world? That's so not going to land. We have to change our game, but we don't want to play the lowest common denominator. And I get to the point of thinking, we cannot compete. There is nothing they will not do. There is no low they will not go to. And we do have scruples. That's what Bannon was saying. There are things you will not do. And they have as many people with PhDs in neuroscience as we do. They know how to hit the lowest common denominator. They own part of the social networks. They are just in the process of buying CNN. They do understand that narrative shift is possible and there is nothing they will not do. How do we play that game in a way that has integrity? Or can we just step off and go, that's not a game we're playing. We're going over here to a completely new game that is based on different rules, where what we who are pro-social wish to do is going to get traction. This is a conundrum I ask myself all the time, and I have no answer to that, to be honest, other than consciousness evolution, narrative shift, which can quite easily end up in, I watch some really flaky things on Facebook. Guys, if you're listening to this podcast, you're not that. And it's basically, we just sit here and hum and think nice thoughts and only think of beauty. We will ascend with the coming ascension and that'll be okay. And that's magical thinking.
Yeah. And spiritual bypassing.
Yeah, totally. Yes.
Postmodern kind of mistaken. Yeah. So, yes. And I mean, you're right. Like that kind of, to some degree, puts paid to the tennis metaphor, because we are talking about, in that sense, we're talking about having to work within the kind of the realm of what is possible from a kind of human cognition and, relational reality point of view. But we're also having to work within hegemony and the existing systems being as they are and where they are and as well funded as they are in this moment. And that, of course, it's somewhat stacked against us. We are very much swimming against the current. And that is very, well, it depends on how you look at that, right? We're swimming against the current of the existing systems, but those systems are swimming against the current of basic reality. So they cannot, I mean, they won't continue, right? I guess we're in the time of the question of how bad that coming to an end is. But I think what we need to learn from what they're doing. We need to learn about how well they operate with the recognition that people are seeking belonging, that people want to feel heard. I think, certainly the center and sort of technocratic elite, the people at the kind of top end in the big institutions, have basically ignored people. I mean, either out of fear or out of, some kind of superiority or whatever, they have ignored where people are at. And as a result, those people have had nothing to turn to, and they've gone to the only people that sound like they're listening to them.
Which are often the same people. Elon Musk was at the march, the 100,000 people in London, and they all think he's on their side.
Yes,
which
exactly.
is weird. Anyway, go on.
But it's because they're desperate, right? The people are in dire straits, and they're looking for the only kind of thing to hold on to, and that's where it is. It's not coming from the center. It's not coming from the technocratic elite. It's not coming from any of the institutions they have, in the past maybe trusted a bit. The trust has evaporated. That has been encouraged, of course, by those bad actors, as it were. But yeah, I think the thing we can learn from them as well, because we can't do the top down thing that they do. We can't do the singular thing that they do. We can't do the hoarded wealth thing that they do. We need to be bottom up. We need to be plural. We need to be sharing resource, etc. But the other thing we can learn from them, I think various people are talking about this at the moment. Dave Snowden being one of them. I think he was on your podcast recently. He makes a really interesting point that these people seem to understand the complexity science quite well, either intuitively or they've done the kind of investigation themselves, and recognize that reality is sort of, well, this is what the claim is, but not causal, but rather dispositional. And that in order to intervene in it and change things and shift things, you have to do so obliquely, so not head on, granularly, and sort of following the adjacent possibles in the situation. If you look at how, what we call the right, but, some people have described it as the me group versus the we group. Again, that's a binary, but which is unhelpful, but it's to some degree helpful to understand what we're talking about. That they have basically been very strategically opportunistic about selecting things like abortion, for example, as an issue to run with, because it was a really great way to build a base that was already there, to animate it, to create division in society, to create outrage, and then eventually to sort of make it a kind of litmus test for people to be in the party or not, and bring others over to the party from, say, in their case, the Democrats into the Republicans. So there's something for us to learn from that. I think we tend to be much more, thinking at the level of the whole system a lot of the time, system change on climate change, like that's accurate. But if we try to change the system, and if we try to do so via massive multilateral processes, we're likely not going to manage, because reality is too complex for that to be really feasible. And I'm massively simplifying that, but that is seemingly what's coming through. So the question is, how do we, I think what the story from, my background in branding and what I'm doing in narrative now is how do we intervene in the conditions that people are in, that are leading to the narrative that emerge from those conditions? And what are the adjacent possibles in that sense that we can operate with? Where can we offer people the belonging and the sense of feeling heard and the sense of liberation that they are so sorely seeking? Where can they offer that themselves? That's a sort of...
Whoa. So let's define where I think some of what we're up against. We're up against an economic system which is fundamentally broken and which is shoveling power to the top very fast. The people at the top understand the nature of narrative and they are shaping narratives that are designed to fragment us and to isolate people so that their only source of safety comes from those controlling the narrative. You already have a question.
And I just want a technical point on
Okay.
this: the system isn't broken; it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
Yes, no, that's very true. Actually, yes, yes. Okay, yes, you're right. The system is. I say that at the beginning of all my talks. The system is not broken. The system is doing exactly what the system was designed to do. And there was a brilliant quote. Yes, I found this the other day from Gramsci. Fascism is capitalism's emergency solution when the ruling class can no longer govern through liberal democracy. And liberal democracy was only ever a way of hoarding power for the few. And it was a story that we were told that alleged to give everybody a say in what was going on, while very carefully assuring that that say did not happen. Democracy in both the US and the UK and other Western countries around the world has only ever been a sham. And I think this is one of the things I get really frustrated about with people who are trying to tweak the very edges of Westminster or any other democracy around the world of, guys, that's not going to take us where we need to go. We need a whole new democratic system, a whole new agreement of who we are. And I watch what Audrey Tang does of giving trust to gain trust, and it isn't hard. We have the models. So yes, okay, the democracy, the system is doing exactly what the system was designed to do, which is shoveling power to the top. It is predicated on the idea of money, which anyone who's worked in the economic space for any time understands. It's treated as if the laws of money are the laws of physics. And I read somebody in the very recent past saying, no, the laws of money are more like a theology.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's an idea that I think that was probably on your website. It's an idea, and we could have another idea tomorrow. We could abandon all of the existing currencies and create new ones that had totally different rules. And as long as there was a flow of value and storage and accounting throughout, it would be fine. And we are facing extinction. I'm reading a whole bunch of things, but one of the things I'm reading is Roger Hallam's book that he wrote in a week, in his last week in prison recently, and it's acting as his input towards the formation of your party. And he's quite explicit on how fast we are beyond 1.5 degrees. We are accelerating towards 3 degrees. Everything that I understand is if we hit 3 degrees, it's game over. We cannot pull back from that. And yet, I had a conversation on Facebook yesterday with somebody who was telling me that the climate was no different now than it was 100 years ago, who obviously genuinely believed this because the misinformation is huge and effective, and it hits the parts of us that want to believe that. We are at heart still limbic beings. I read somewhere while I was away that the amount of decision making that happens in our cortex is 0.05% of our overall decision making, and that's usually, that's when we're doing arithmetic or fundamental maths. It's not our beingness. And so consciousness shift, we come back to, we need to evolve. We need to grow up. We need to move, as Bill Plotkin says, from early adolescence to elderhood in a generation very, very fast. And I said that on a stage several times, actually, while I was away, and watched people get really triggered and really upset that I was suggesting, first of all, that we were not all adult and that we should do the work and that it was possible to do the work. And their takeaway from that was that I was accusing them of being lazy, basically, which is possibly true. I need to look at my own stuff there. But we need to do the work. And if that's accusing people of being lazy, I don't think that really matters. And if we get triggered by that, we need to do the work. So, where am I taking this? That narrative shift and consciousness shift are indivisibly linked. That we are actually facing people who understand this and who are doing their best. I don't understand fully where the Bannon-Musk people, other than they want to take us back to the time of the Inquisition, because that was the last time the world was aligned the way they want it. But that's not a sustainable world unless they are assuming that there's going to be the same number of people on the world as they were at the time of the Inquisition, and that most of them will be peasantry, which is possible. But I don't see how that stops us getting to 3 degrees. And they must know, however much they're in denial, there must be a level at which they know we're heading over the edge of the cliff. And yet, I still think there is time to turn. So, in your view of the world, how do we help shape, shift, move our consciousness in a way that I'm back to fractal shifts, that the very slow, we wait until a community is in crisis and then we go and help them work out how to not be in crisis, seems to me to be locked within the old paradigm. It's not taking us to new paradigm thinking, which is one of the ways I perhaps misunderstood Dave Snowden, but it seems to be within very old paradigm thinking, and I think we need completely different paradigm thinking. Where does that take you?
A few different places. So first of all, I think the interaction with people where they are being triggered by what you're saying is in a sense a part of what the complexity science points to, that we can't go head on. We have to go obliquely and plant seeds within people. Having done that, that will have planted a seed within them, unless they've gone very strongly against what you said, in which case they will have doubled down in the other direction, which we know happens. But one thing that I found quite useful, I think it was in Alan Gera-Haradas's book, The Persuaders, where he talks to various people, including Anna Shankar-Osorio, who's a great comms genius in the US. And she in that, I think it was her that was talking about this, refers to the golden gate of retreat. Immediately I'm realizing it wasn't her, it was actually AOC's comms person, I think, that gave her that idea. But basically that when encouraging somebody to do something that is very different to what they're already doing, and that might implicate them in some harm, in their recognition that they need to change, which of course is where we all are, because as Vanessa Andreotti quite rightly points out, our systems are fundamentally and inherently violent and unsustainable, that it's not an unfortunate byproduct, that's what they depend on to exist. So all of our lifestyle...
This is the trauma culture.
Yeah. So, and that separability that underlies that, belief in separability. So there's something about how we again provide the conditions for people to have epiphanies that they can then sort of own to some extent and find themselves into their own journeys of healing. Because as we know from any trauma or cult recovery process, and I think cult recovery is a very interesting kind of process for us to be paying attention to, and addiction recovery in particular, is it has to be self-selecting. Otherwise, it doesn't work. We won't go into it.
You have to give people agency in their own recovery, or else you're just manipulating them again, and they're still the same person.
Yes, and that that comes back to that question of if narrative is emerging from the conditions that we're in, if it's a sort of product of that, if you like, if it's what is emerging between us as our kind of mechanism for attempting to make sense of complex reality with our fundamentally limited cognition, even as we understand it to be more distributed and embodied and ecological than we have in the past, like it's still limited. So if narrative is that, and it's emerging from those conditions, and that's like our the world we're wandering around in, the houses we're living in, the cars we're driving, the shops we're going into, the hospitals we visit, the technology we use, all of that stuff. If that's all providing the conditions for the narratives to emerge from, we are in a sort of chicken or egg situation where those conditions really need to alter in order for the narratives to alter.
Right. But the narratives have to alter in order for the conditions to alter. And how do we intervene in that closed system?
Well, I guess so. It depends on what we mean by narratives in that sense, right? Because there's the narratives that exist between us, and we can't actively change those. Really, we can work on the conditions to try and bring about something different emerging. But there's the other kind of narrative, which is the literal narratives we create in our pop culture, in our storytelling, in our political messaging, in our journalism, and we can change those. And I think a lot of what narrative change work seems to have been about, recently at least, is sort of that, like change the media narrative. And that is more doable because you can just, you get enough people saying something different by giving them the right materials to say something different. And and that will have an effect. That's part of the conditions people are in, from which narratives are emerging between them. And they really need different words for these things. I think that's the part of the problem here.
Yeah.
Narrative, that word that gets
Yes.
kind of used to mean a lot of different things. But in that sense, as storytellers, as people who are just wandering about in society, we can influence those conditions by telling different stories. But we have to be cognizant that, like, at the end of the day, unless those conditions fundamentally change as well as that happening, then the narratives that emerge between us will stay the same, or consciousness won't be going anywhere because it's being held habitually in this kind of in this set of conditions. And I think the other thing that is helpful to talk about here is habit and habit forming. And I've certainly found it helpful myself to sort of think of narrative formation as a bit like how habits function for us in the brain. But I'll just pause there in case there's anything you wanted to.
Yes. No, I want to go there. Okay, but in between. So, consciousness shift. Let's look at this. So one of the things that I have internalized, which may be untrue, is that when we're in sympathetic or dorsal vagal overload, our capacity for creativity is much less. And we need that creative space to begin to weave things together differently in our brain to create new narratives. Otherwise, we default to the narratives that are locked most deeply in our limbic systems. And that one of the things that the right is very good at doing is creating sufficient stress and trauma that we lose our creative capacity. And I'm sure that's not accidental, but I'm also sure that's been happening for many thousands of years. That's the nature of the trauma culture, is to lock us in sympathetic overload so that we cannot be creative. That's why Rob Hopkins says that capitalism is a disimagination machine. However, I've recently been reading Jane McGonigal's book, Imaginable, and she has an idea which has really taken off in my head, that when we are looking at the present or the past, when we're recycling the existing Lego blocks inside, basically, we're using 5 parts of our brain, and she lists them, and it doesn't really matter, but it's hippocampus, then dorsomedial prefrontal, and then limbic system. To imagine a future that does not exist yet. So if I ask you what you can do tomorrow, it will basically be a reiteration of everything you've done in the past few days, but probably looped together slightly differently because tomorrow's a different day. If I say, okay, 10 years from now, what we do on a neurocognitive level is go into our hippocampus and look at all the Lego blocks that are available and try to stitch them together in a way that we think might stand up 10 years from now. And actually, we can't do that because the world is changing very fast now. But we cannot imagine things that are not already there. Then we go to our ventromedial prefrontal cortex and go, how does this fit with my aims and desires, my philosophy, my sense of who I am as a human being? And then we check with our limbic system of basically, does that feel good or does it feel bad? And it takes 11 parts of our brain to do that future casting, where what am I doing tomorrow is basically past casting forward. It takes 5 parts of our brain. And that's huge cognitive load that fundamentally, evolutionarily, we're not that keen to do because we like to do the things that are straightforward. And if what you and I are trying to do is basically take the Lego bricks and just go, okay, Lego bricks, not a good thing here. Can we plant seeds of something that's completely different? We're asking people to do enormous cognitive work. And nobody can do anything other than stitch together what's already in there. We can reconfigure it in new ways, but we're not creating de novo. And so what you and I are trying to do, I think, is what we can do is take stuff in. This is what Rob Hopkins talks about future casting, is here, let me give you a whole new set of ideas to begin to plant seeds in your brain, or create Lego bricks of a different color, whatever metaphor we're using, such that when I ask you to do that 11 parts of your brain, really hard cognitive work, you've at least got material to work with. And when you check with your prefrontal cortex and your limbic system, it will feel good. And in order to do all of that, I have to have the cognitive space. And the more stressed I become, the less cognitive space I have. And that you and I could create as many new little Lego bricks and or seeds as we like. But if people are stressed, they cannot It's actually a physiological impossibility to take those bits in. And therefore, that one of the things we can do that's most useful, this is one of the things I was thinking about this morning. What happens if we create the energetic space? This was related to, let me just find it, something that you put up on, you shared on LinkedIn recently with Lanson Burroughs-Jones Jr. about neuroscience just confirmed superconsciousness as a gamma wave state ignition, uniting brain, heart, and body in coherence quantum state. And this seems to me we're edging now towards the edge of where cognitive neuroscience meets mysticism, meets energetics, meets narrative shift, which is we actually need to be in phase shift. We need to be in a different energetic space. If our capacity to change shift changes the wave state of our brain and therefore changes the energetic state around us, we have the capacity to help other people make that phase shift. In the same way that the right manages to get everybody very afraid and very deep into limbic reactivity that is very tribal, and you reduce and reduce and reduce what people's tribes are. So you end up with this kind of distilled natured tribalism, so that, let's say, only the straight white men are allowed to have power, and that ripples outwards. That's one phase state, and I can feel, even saying that my brain goes into defensive mode. Whereas if we can create cognitive state where we are linking in to heart mind and our connection to the more than human world and our connection between each other, which exists even on Zoom. We've noticed doing the shamanic work that we can link people, someone in Massachusetts with somebody in New Zealand, and they can do extraordinary energetic work together, probably better than when they're in the same room, because there's something about being in your home space that lets you feel more energetically open and coherent. And so we know this is possible. And I would say my theory of change at the moment of who we are as a human species, the consciousness shift that we need to make, is that we can shift into that gamma state somehow and create gamma resonance such that people for whom those words would never land, and that's not a pejorative thing, it's just that's not where their minds are at, are given the energetic space whereby conscious evolution might work. First of all, is this making sense? And second, how is it landing? And third, where does it take you?
It's making perfect sense. I think it addresses, we talk about spaces for healing, but what we don't often acknowledge the need for necessarily following that is spaces to remain healed in. Because as we know, you can't heal from something within the conditions that's caused the original harm. So that causes a problem for us as we try to essentially create kind of pockets within harmful systems within which to remain healed, having gone through some kind of process of healing. So how to sort of create a sort of constancy for people as they go on this journey. I think the sort of recent Nobel Prize that talks about non-locality is sort of maybe explaining some of what's happening on Zoom there. I had a similar experience here with an intuitive healer in Glasgow who can do phenomenal things somehow through a Zoom screen, which I can't understand, and can never hope to really, I guess. But where it also takes me is that everything you just said is super fascinating and very much what I love thinking about. But we're in a situation where ordinary people are being pulled over to these forces that are deeply destructive for them and everything else, because they have immediate material pain and grief that they are not able to resolve through our existing system. So what the version of that is on the ground where ordinary people are right now is a crucial thing for us to be orienting around. There was a great article that someone I admire greatly, Amara Spence, wrote this week, which I think has sort of been shared about quite a bit, called "Who is Organizing Poor White Folks Towards Liberation?" In which she said, this is not about saving poor white people, it's about refusing to let fascism monopolize their grief. It's about refusing to cede the terrain of belonging, ritual, and story to the far right. And that yeah, that feels like a very kind of an imperative to sort of grapple with. And I look to people like Imi Kaur and others around the country who are doing, in this country at least, who are doing extraordinary work at the level of community to give people the experience of something different, those different Lego bricks, um, putting them in their hands to actually kind of have that experience of a different future. People, the famous saying that was always there in climate, like people can't think about the end of the world, they're worried about the end of the day or the week. So trying to sort of think 10 years down the line is hard. We need to like make it here and now. I thought Kate Raworth put it well. She's like, the Milton Friedman quote, in
The
a quote,
ideas that are lying around are the ones that get
yeah.
picked up.
And
Yeah.
she was like, why are they lying around? Let's get them on their feet. Like, yeah. And that is happening more and more. There's a project called Antidote, which I'm sort of a bit involved in, which is trying to surface stories of people just getting on with it where they are, building different ways of being, all of which offer the opportunity for the kind of healing, I suppose you could call it, that you're describing there, from that LinkedIn post. And I think what is difficult is that for so many of us, and I include myself in this, of course, who have come from a tradition like I did in a sort of ivory tower, literally ivory tower, of kind of handing down strategy from on high, and kind of thinking in words and language, and that's going to kind of fix it all. There's an uncomfortable process of us like getting onto the ground, getting our hands into the soil. Like this is what we're talking about here is the soil of everything, and we need to get our hands in it. And that can be difficult. I don't know how to do that. I haven't done that before. Like I'm not a community organizer. I've got no experience of that, but I'm sort of recognizing that that's more and more where I need to be, whilst also acknowledging that I have privilege and a position and a set of skills that can be useful in some kind of other way in that process. But yeah, I think that piece in particular from Amara recently was very kind of galvanizing with this in mind. Um, so. Yes, I mean, I was saying earlier about the deep narrative work. We've been talking to people about that a bit, and there's so much fascinating research. Like that word deep narrative encompasses myriad concepts from various different sciences and indigenous wisdoms and all sorts of other places. And this person we were talking to was like, yeah, you're going to have to make that much simpler if you're going to get people to understand it. And that is a big part of our challenge. It's like, how do we kind of bring about sufficiently simple understanding in an inherently unknowable complexity, not just unknown, but unknowable complexity, to be able to kind of act in a moment and heal in a moment where we risk everything coming down. And yeah, that's a very animating question, and there are suggestions, but definite answers. Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe.
Hmm. Yeah, gosh, this opens up so many doors, doesn't it? So one of the things that's floating to the top of my head, or two things. First is Jonathan Haidt did a lot of work a long time ago about the fact that righteous anger is one of the most addictive things on the planet. It's the equivalent of a noseful of cocaine the first time, and cocaine is there's always that law of diminishing returns, but righteous anger seems to hit it every single time. And yet, I'm thinking of Zach Polanski, who is increasingly impressing me, the new leader of the Green Party in the UK, and he put out a podcast that I listened to yesterday. It's out fairly recently, with someone called Jimmy the Giant, who used to be a Tommy Robinson follower and is now a member of the Green Party, and a working class white lad. Sounds like East London. Please, my capacity to read English accents is not great, so that's wrong. I apologise. And at the start of that podcast, Zach says, "You were my second choice," because my first choice, Zach, as soon as he was elected leader of the Green Party, he went to Clacton, which is Nigel Farage. For those not in the UK, that's basically the billionaire fascist who's trying to take over the UK, one of them. And Clacton is Farage's constituency. He never goes there, but technically he's MP. And he walked around with a microphone and talked to people. And one of the people he talked to was an Irishman who said, yes, obviously I am an immigrant. I came over from Ireland and now I'm in Clacton. But look at this place. Look around. It's expletive deleted, a mess. And I am resorting to the only thing I know. And they had a good conversation. He said, "Do you want to come on the podcast?" And yes. But then 2 days before, he wrote in and said, "Sorry, I can't. I've got a shift at work." And instead, so they had Jimmy the Giant, who is also a working class East London lad, I think, who is now really exploring the narrative within his straight white working class lad framing. And it seemed to me, listening to that, I also then went to Audrey Tang's work on giving trust to gain trust. There's huge creativity there. And very few people consider themselves to be innately evil and consider themselves to be deliberately doing harm. They're going with the options that they believe to be open. And that somewhere along the line, I'm looking at the work that our house is doing on the People's Charter, going around all the places that they can think of and giving people a chance to consider, what would you like the Charter to be in your constituency? I'm looking at the way your party, the Corbyn Sultana party in the UK, so for people not in the UK, this is Jeremy Corbyn, who used to be leader of the Labour Party, and just for a little fraction of time, there was a glimmer of hope that Labour might not be a far-right institution. And joined with Zara Sultana, and they are, sounds to me like, really trying to create a narrative of difference and a different way of being political that is still shoehorned into the existing system, because absent a revolution, you have to work with the system that you've got. And each of these is about giving individuals and community a sense of agency and community. And that when people have a sense of community in which they can feel pride, then we are working with a different set of neurochemistry. That pride meets our serotonin system, and the serotonin mesh is enduring and additive and all of the things that dopamine hits aren't. And it works against the dopamine farming that seems to be most of what the right is aiming for. Outrage and reactivity and defensiveness, whereas serotonin is about inclusion and connection. And that somewhere in that, you and I both exist, we exist in a space where we have the privilege of being able to think about stuff and occasionally being able to meditate and do the things that help us to reset the zeros on our own triggered neurocognitive systems, where other people are, exactly as you said, basically trying to get to the end of the day and survive and feed their kids and not get kicked out of a house that they're renting by some landlord who's decided they can get twice the rent from somebody else. Our entire system is broken. And as you said at the start, it's not broken, it's doing what it's meant to do, but it's not fit for purpose. And helping people to imagine what a fit for purpose system would look like, while giving them ideas that are not simply the ones currently in circulation, seems to me what narrative shift is about. It's about presenting different concepts of how the world could be that are pro-social.
Yeah. And we my colleague Ella and I have been talking about a sort of kind of model to think about different roles for story, and we think about the role of modeling, demonstrating possible futures and how to get there, importantly, the kind of Fruitopian idea, and bringing those to life and in the form of story that is possible. But ideally, people are experiencing that. People are doing it. They're on the ground. It's in their hands. It's not some distant, far away thing. It's something that's here and now, because their needs and their grief and their pain is here and now. And then also signaling, showing where that's actually already alive. And that's, again, what the Antidote Project is doing a bit of. But there is a key dimension underneath all of that, which is tending, which is bringing and cultivating that soil that is healthier, essentially, that is, full of the values and the mindsets and the other things we might think of down there, that are pro-social, that are kind of healed, that are, oriented towards different futures, but recognizing that those things are constantly in motion, constantly in flux. And I mean, there's a good article that came out recently from someone, and I'm really aware of the title of this.
Of the time? Yes, you have to go.
Sorry, the time I have to go, yeah. But there's an article called "Stop Trying to Change Mindsets, Do This Instead." And I'm so conscious of that because I have good friends who work in exactly that, in changing mindsets. And I don't think it's saying that what they're doing is wrong. But it's understanding, as they say, that the individual action is the collective action, that we are, as the quantum mechanics, the relational quantum mechanics, logical systems theory, all of this stuff is revealing we are all one thing. We're all kind of talking to ourselves, talking to each other, talking as one sort of existence, one consciousness maybe. And I think that thinking about the intra work as well as the inner work is therefore maybe a way of thinking about what we're doing here and recognizing how we are all participating in the continuous creation of this dream we call reality, and how we might dream something different, what it would take to do that, what conditions are required for that.
Okay, you have to go. That feels like a really good. We could obviously talk for at least another hour. Paddy, please let's do this again. Let's have a rematch. I'm booked for the next 6 months, so it would be next spring, but please let's do this again, because it feels like we have so much else to talk about. But
Great.
thank you for your time today. And that feels like dreaming our way into a new reality is exactly what we're about. And then giving it the stories that help people see how amazing it could be. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you,
on to the
Amanda.
Accidental Gods podcast. And we will definitely do this again.
Myself.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.